All right, folks, here we go. Thank you very much for joining us. I do appreciate you giving time for something that I believe is important. That's why I'm doing it. I thank you if you're a subscriber, and I ask that if you do enjoy these subscriptions and the dialogue that we're having, that you would share it with somebody else. I also ask that if you are viewing for the first time and if you like it, please share it with 5 other people. And if not, then just text stop and you will not get any. Jumping into something that I've mentioned before, I have apologized to our kids for not protesting in the street. And it somewhat seemed to be a facetious comment. It was more figurative, but it has become literal now that we have not done something sooner. One of my favorite quotes of all time, great movie, Braveheart, and William Wallace, the character played by Mel Gibson, says, "Every man dies. Some men never really live." And that is something that has spoke to me since the time I first seen it. And some people are critical of me because I quote movies a lot. Well, the difference for me is I'll quote a book now and again, but I've watched a lot more movies than I've read books. I read slow. It's just the way it is. I do read often. I read every day. And yet, the thing that keeps coming back to me is I've probably learned more about life from my Gramp, my dad's dad, than anyone that I've ever encountered. Any movie, any book I've read, any movie I've watched, my education. I learned more about life from Gramp than anyone else. And I definitely learned more about death through Gramp's life and the moment his heart stopped beating. And I'll say it again today. Thank you, God, for your perfect plan, your perfect will in taking Gramp. And to give you just one example, Gramp was the first person that passed away that was that close to me. That I remember praying and asking for him to not die. And I didn't understand it for a couple of years. It was that much of an impact. But that was the best thing that could have ever happened. My Gramp lived right up until that last day. He lived. And I don't want to sound like I have a lack of empathy for where we have gone to a society, but there's a difference between living and being kept alive. And Bill Bonner is somebody that I read quite often, and he remembered when his mother got sick not too long ago. And she wasn't feeling very good. She's 92 years old at this time, and they take her to the hospital, and the doctor checks her out and says, "There's really nothing I can do for you, but I can't let you go home. It's not safe for you to go home." And at 92, still sharp as a tack, said, "Yeah, well, I'm going home. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die at home, not in a hospital ward." And so I really think about the ability for us to be able to have that choice, for us to be able to make that decision. We do not know what our destiny is and when we are the end is going to happen for us. Certainly, if we only cared about keeping people safe, no one would leave their house and they would not drive on the highways. Of course, that's not reasonable, right? Well, a lot of what's being placed upon us in the name of reasonable and unreasonable, essential and unessential, speaks to the same thing. These terms like the most vulnerable amongst us, those with underlying conditions, the suggestion that, and this ought to give us a lot of cause to look internally, but for the people on television, the talking heads, to say now that the COVID-19 virus is also racist should really give us some real deep reflection about how did we get to here? Because To quote Bob Woodson, to quote Thomas Sowell, and there's many others. But if everything's racist, then nothing is racist. So I think we really need to be careful here who we listen to. I mean, it's a virus. That's it. It is to be respected, just not feared. Well, what about the people in our mental health, with mental health issues in our society? The people that have been battling a fight, and so many, 60 to 70,000 a year dying through the opioid addiction. The people that are in recovery, between opioids and alcohol-related deaths and suicide, would be considered, a lot of it be considered our mental health citizenry. Those are the people that are not talked about, that are the most vulnerable. Those are the ones that we will never see on a list. Oh, or wait a minute. Will we see them on a list of COVID-19 deaths? Because so far it really looks like there's some strong indications that the COVID-19 is the reason for almost all deaths. Where is the death from the flu, from pneumonia, congestive heart disease? And I know what they've been saying. We must trust the science. Well, the science told us that 2 to 5 million people were going to die. We're going to need more ventilators, more respirators. And before you get started, when you say, well, but we did so many things, we mitigated the death. All of those models had the mitigation steps already in place, and they continue to be refined. So when you say to me, I have to trust the science is wrong when it comes to the weather, meteorologists. The science is wrong when it comes to health, the epidemiologists. How about supporting our immune system? We don't talk enough about supporting our immune system, probably because Big Pharma can't make money off this. 70% of the American population have a lack of sleep every month, and that causes a weakened immune system. 11% of the American population have a lack of sleep on a daily basis, which suppresses the immune system. Also, with the immune system is alcohol. And yet, liquor stores is a consideration for an essential business to be open. The suppression of an immune system, it suggests to me, if I look at the science, if I look at the numbers, and I really evaluate it, it suggests to me that you really don't care about the human population, but what you do care about is money and control. That's where I see this thing, where it was birthed out of and where it's headed. So it's about collecting taxes, the tax revenue for alcohol. And I'm all about, they've been lying to us for years, for 80 years, about no medicinal purposes or aspects to marijuana and hemp. Now that you can figure out a way to start collecting taxes on it, of course you're going to leave that open. So let's try to figure out what the lies are, what the truth is, what the science is. So maybe this has always been about the money. Maybe this has always been about control. Maybe this has always been about a November election. When I think of these things, I think, man, I must be crazy. I run it by my brother. He's one of the most level-headed, easygoing guys I know. And even he admits he does not think it's a coincidence that this happened in the year, because there's a vast amount of people in power that can't believe Donald Trump became a president, and they certainly are not going to sit idly by for the potential for a re-election. One of my, I just want to share this thought real quick. One of our teammates, Andrew, sent this to me, and when you think about this, it's really kind of true. And it was a tweet. If someone told us 10 years ago, let's think back to 2010, 10 years ago, that the government would pay us to stay at home the entire month of 4/20, and that you could only leave your house to pick up food and weed, we never would have believed them. That's a pretty interesting point. We 10 years ago, You're a conspiratorial theory lunatic. That's what you would have told me. Think about this, though. It's brought to my attention today in one of the things that I read, and that is BlackRock's adorably small fees lead to ridiculously big money, even in a downturn. Check your 401k or brokerage account. There's a high likelihood that you've got some money in a BlackRock fund since it's the world's largest money manager. But the investment giant's profits fell 23% as its individual and institutional customers panic sold stocks for liquid cash. Less money to manage equals less profit for BlackRock. Okay, that makes sense. Assets under management shrank from 7.4 trillion at the end of 2019 to 6.5 trillion at the end of March. Still not too shabby considering America's GDP was 21 trillion in 2018. Wait a minute. Did you just realize something? That one company has 1/3 of America's GDP in assets under management. I wonder, what else do we know or not know about BlackRock? Let's see if there's anything else that comes on the radar regarding BlackRock during this time right now. So again, another person I like to read, Bill Bonner. And I think this was maybe a day or two ago, but he quotes, this is Milton Friedman on the Phil Donahue show years ago. Because Phil Donahue hasn't had a show on for a long 1979. Sorry, I see it, 1979. Quote, this world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaucrats. Einstein didn't discover his theory of relativity on an order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way either. In the only cases the masses have escaped the grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they've had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worse off, it's exactly the kinds of societies that depart from that. So the record of history is absolutely crystal clear. There is no alternative way, so far discovered, of improving the lives of ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system. And I remember the day that I saw the bumper sticker that said, "Liberty is the only economic stimulus that we need." And I thought, wow, that's a pretty good quote. Going to read Brian Maher, and he has a way of writing, and the Daily Reckoning. He quote, the raging pandemic has served one high and worthy purpose. It has made obvious to all with open eyes that the stock market's a crook's game, a vast swindle. How else could the stock market regain so many of its initial pandemic losses, while 16 million Americans file unemployment claims and second quarter GDP may contract 40%? How is this possible? The Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet some 1.6 trillion these past 4 weeks. There is your answer. That's it. All vestiges of fair and honest markets have gone whooshing down the chute. The Federal Reserve heads a tremendous gambling racket. It deals dishonest cards. It weights the dice. It tinkers the slots. Anything and everything it will do to rook bears out of their rightful jackpots. And so we ask, where would the stock market presently sit without the Federal Reserve's massive fixing? The numbers men at One River Asset Management have tackled the question. But first, let's look at the blackjack table. The raging pandemic, sorry, my apologies. Where have we gone? How did we get here? And why today's setback? We learned this morning that March retail sales plunged a savage 8.7%, a record jolt to business. No previous figure approaches it. We further learned that the United States industrial production plunged 5.4% month over month. That represents its steepest monthly fall since January 1946, not long after the nation began beating its belligerent swords into peaceful plowshares. Meantime, earnings season is once again upon us, and corporate earnings are presently dropping away. Bank of America claims first quarter profits plummeted 45%. Citigroup profits went down 46%. Goldman Sachs also reported a violent 46% retreat. Quincy Crosby, Prudential Financial's chief market strategist, drips icy sweat as he canvasses the numbers. Quote, if this is a precursor to what we can expect to the U.S., there's no word for it. This reflects the complete shutdown of the economy. End quote. Yes, it does. Yet the abysmal numbers were all but guaranteed, and still the stock market jumped for the last 2 weeks. Yes, the market was down today. That was a couple days ago. Yet we suspect further pledges of Federal Reserve trickery will coax stocks up yet again for a time at least. And since that article was written yesterday and today, it's up over 500 points when I last looked in. How about a new investment strategy from the same article further down? And it states, BlackRock is the largest asset manager on earth. Oh, we've already talked about BlackRock, didn't we? It is also in command of the Federal Reserve's asset purchasing program. Wait, hold on. I thought the Fed was helping everybody out, buying treasuries. Wait a minute. It's also in command of the Federal Reserve's asset purchasing program. So they're deciding what the Federal Reserve is going to buy. BlackRock. Okay. This is the program that is lifting creaky debt off corporate balance sheets and dropping it into taxpayers' laps. There you go. That's it. I knew I was buying all of it. You, me, all of us. I knew we were buying all of this debt. And what is BlackRock's present investment strategy, you ask? To simply hitch its cart to whichever asset the Federal Reserve purchases, explains Mr. Rick Ryder, director of BlackRock's Global Allocation Unit. Quote, we will follow the Fed and other developed market central banks by purchasing what they're purchasing and assets that rhyme with those, end quote. That is, the central banks will ultimately select BlackRock's investments. What kind of capitalism is this? Can you say picking winners? And is there not something uniquely swinish about this arrangement? Perhaps even unlawful? Insider trading? Do rules apply to anybody else other than the minions? BlackRock is directly involved in the Federal Reserve's asset purchases. It therefore knows which assets will get a lift. It can place its wagers accordingly before all others. Where is the Securities and Exchange Commission to investigate insider trading? Well, it's not going to happen. Meantime, labor productivity averaged 3.2% annual growth from World War II through the end of the 20th century. But since 2011, a mere 0.7%. The United States government borrowed perhaps $12 trillion since the financial crisis, even before this latest debt delirium. But the American economy expanded only 5.1 trillion over the same pace. So let's say, that is, GDP increased 35%, but the national debt increased 122% debt. So where's the productivity going to come from that's going to offset this? We presently confront spiraling debt and diminishing growth. The unfolding cataclysm will only deepen the trend, concludes Michael Lebowitz of Real Investment Advice. Quote, given the finite ability to service debt outstanding, future economic growth, if we are to have it, will need to be based largely on gains in productivity, end quote. Well, if we only knew the source of that productivity. But we conclude by returning to the question of our day, where would this stock market presently sit without the Fed's mammoth manipulations? And at One River Asset Management, the answer was down 80%. Well, if it's not about money, I don't know what is. Because so many of us have always said it's always about the money. Follow the money. These are old things. Now, I don't want to sound like I have a lack of empathy, but I keep being told I got to trust the science. So this is Dave Gonigan, and this is in regards to authoritative medical guidelines. So wrote the editor of the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine in 2009. So let's go back 11 years and figure this out. And added the editor of Britain's equally prestigious The Lancet in 2015, quote, "The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession of pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn toward darkness," end quote. Well, but you keep telling me I got to trust the science. You got to believe in the numbers. 11 years ago, they're talking about how at least half of it is simply untrue. Let's look at this a little bit deeper here. We don't wish to downplay the threat of a threat posed by a pandemic, but you see how science is a lot more squishy than the scientists care to let on at the time. That's worth keeping in mind whenever the establishment bows at the feet of Anthony Dr. McDreamy Fauci, as he pipes up about the need to maintain lockdown until, well, whenever the science says it can be lifted. Listen to the scientists, right? So if we just look back on history, February 17th, Fauci described the danger from the coronavirus as just minuscule, in contrast to the real and present danger of the flu. And it's worth keeping in mind at Harvard, as Harvard researchers issued the following proclamation this past week. Quote, under current critical care capacities, the overall duration of the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic could last into 2022, requiring social distancing measures to be in place between 25 and 75% of that time. So on again, off again, intermittent distancing. I mentioned to you before that I thought a lot of these things, again, slowly at first, and then all of a sudden, you're going to start to see more and more control. More and more control. Again, I go back to the empathy. I don't want it to look like I don't have any empathy towards the people that are battling this and dying. And versus, let's say, the governor of Michigan, who suggests that she has a lot of empathy and she's trying to help out. There's another quote from a movie. Get busy living or get busy dying. And what I see is a lack of empathy. I do see a lack of empathy from people on social media that wants to start discounting my right to choose about a vaccine. I'll bet all you people are wishing you had vaccines now. Well, we've had a lot of issues with vaccines, and that's a lack of empathy for all of the people who have suffered from illegitimate vaccines. I've done an entire podcast on the Bill Gates Foundation and vaccines and the trouble that it's causing. As a matter of fact, polio is having a resurgence, and it's a vaccine strain. It's not talked about enough. How about allowing the human immune system to be boosted in such a way, not through a vaccine, but through talking about better sleep, better nutrition? I'm going to keep getting busy living. And that's what I hope the rest of my citizens do. No, I don't want to count on more vaccines. Yes, treatment, yes. And maybe there is a vaccine in my future, but I want it to be by my choice, because I'm telling you, what they're getting us ready for, what they're conditioning our minds for, is that we're going to need to have a card. It's going to be on our phone. It's going to be our health card for us to even travel, to leave our homes, to leave the state, to go to a vacation home. We are going to be required to have our paperwork in order. This reminds you of Nazi Germany? This is where this is going. It's already happening in China. And we want to think that that's someplace else and it's not going to happen to us. It is happening to us. Think about this. 650,000 people a year die from the flu. Did we have a lack of empathy then when we didn't shut down the world's economy because of it? 650,000 people a year annually. across the globe die from the flu. Did we have a lack of empathy then? Okay, I don't think that this is just a coincidence. Jim Rickards, I read him a lot, and he had the probability of Donald Trump being reelected at 85%. And he looks at large systems and their interactions. Unless something happens, is how he put it. Now, again, he's taking into consideration that the entire time that President Trump has been in office, something has been happening. It's collusion with Russia. It's campaign finance. It's some sort of infidelity that was lied about. It's impeachment. We need to impeach him. It's a Ukraine. It's back to the impeachment. There's been one thing after another. No collusion. He's been vindicated on everything. It's been a disgrace that we couldn't move on and try to solve real issues. So let's look at the way, on a more local level, how the governors are handling this, Democrats versus Republicans. And in Michigan, we've been on the news a lot because our constitutional rights are illegally being suppressed. And if you look at South Dakota and Oklahoma, those governors respect liberty and freedom. And I think anyone can look at how these things have been handled and say, well, but they're not hotspots and they're going to get it anyway. Something tells me there's a lack of empathy in those comments, and people are hoping that somebody else pays. I want to be right. I want those people to die. That's how I see this lack of empathy. I know people have suffered from this COVID-19. But the ones we're not talking about are those people that I mentioned earlier. The folks that I got a chance to spend a little bit of time with yesterday talked about, and they rattled off a number of names. They talked about how they work in the addiction world. And they talk about how 2 months ago, they felt like they were really turning a corner. So many people were employed. So many systems were funded. People were really feeling good about the efforts they were doing. And just in these last 2 weeks, the number of deaths that they've in their little circle, because it's overwhelming. That's the people that are most vulnerable in our society. We need to remember that. I want to give a shout out to Coach Mike Gundy from Oklahoma State University too. He's wanting to get busy about let's get back in, let's have practice. He's not about a lack of care for his student athletes. He wants to move on with life. He wants to get busy living. So I do appreciate the governors of Oklahoma and South Dakota, just as two examples, because when you compare that to, we just got to look at the numbers. Well, we looked at the numbers. Nowhere near as many people died. We didn't need as many hospital beds, as many ventilators. I'll tell you what we do need, though. We need more testing. What would testing suggest to us if we spent the same effort to have those tests right now for everybody? Tests. It might suggest that the mortality rate for this is actually less than the flu. And we couldn't justify keeping people locked down in their homes and taking away their constitutional rights. That's really what large-scale testing is probably going to reveal. And if that was the case, then we'd say to ourselves, no, we're not going to stay in our home. We're going to wash our hands more. We might wear a mask if I want to. I'm not going to stand too close to people in public. We might still say that, but we're going to get busy living. Remember, slowly at first, and then all of a sudden. This is about control. I'm convinced of it more than ever. This is an ever-increasing police surveillance state. If you think I'm crazy, then you might be thinking to yourself, well, man, I mean, that's never going to happen here. We are willingly allowing our liberties and freedoms to be taken away by authoritarian, tyrannical government overreach. We must take back our country. When we looked at the Hong Kong protests, and that's them though. I mean, yes, I mean, okay, so China's oppressive. China is authoritative, tyrannical rule. That's Hong Kong though. That's their issues. If you look at the Chile protests last year, but that, I know it's the shining star of the democratic civilized state in the Western Hemisphere and in South America. I know that was just that incident. And then if you look at the protests in France, but that's France, and you know they can be temperamental, and I mean that's a socialist extreme anyway. That's what's coming here. What was representative in Lansing was not a Trump rally as dismissed by our governor. It is that, and this is very much what we see on Facebook. It's what many of you have shared with me. There is a never before seen, not in my lifetime, an ever-present, close to the surface level of anarchy. I'd rather we had no rule than this oppressive rule. That's the kind of things that are being talked about. And I encourage everyone, non-violent, civil disobedience. Don't hurt anybody. That's where we need to be. We need to have a show of strength. That this isn't about a political rally. This is about me and my neighbors. What essential business do I have? The one I put every ounce of energy into, my life savings, my sweat, my blood, every bit of my effort into my business is essential. That's the essential business. So if we look at this and we realize that our elected officials have been regularly re-educated once they got into office, once they got to Washington, once they got to Lansing, especially the presidents, they've been re-educated. And I hold to this, that's what, that JFK was not willing to be fully re-educated. Maybe on some things he would compromise, but on others, both Kennedys, Bobby and JFK, were unwilling to compromise on everything. And I really do believe that that is as good an example as the deep state of taking care of things as you can. Bureaucrats, they're rarely seen, but policymakers, they are. We know something's wrong. We know it. It's common sense. But the challenge for us, for all of us, is that common sense is just not so common. Remember Ken Shamrock, the world's most dangerous man. I am the world's most dangerous man. I want you to join with me so that we can have an army of the world's most dangerous men. What is that? That's an independent, free-thinking American citizen, a Christian with free will. That makes me the world's most dangerous man. More is coming, folks. More is coming. I hope we can continue this conversation. The scope of my podcast, if you look back on them, and I encourage you to do it because I don't want to have to restate it all. But what I am doing is an attempt to try to continue this conversation, have dialogue. I appreciate real conversations. For those of you who don't agree with everything I'm saying here, I agree that with the pushback from the people on Team CWC that say, well, yeah, but what about this? And I really do appreciate that what I found is that there's more of a desire to have real conversation and not just shout the other side into silence. And so please keep sharing that information with me. If you like what you've seen here today, please share it with somebody else. Please subscribe if you're not a subscriber. And I appreciate all of you who already have decided to be a subscriber. I just want to tell you that until the next time we talk, I hope you're reading something away from the mainstream media. And until then, I'm James Detroit, and I'm out.